gonna draw, 'cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art. If you don't like it, smell a flower. 'Cause I'm not good here without power. Who's the boss? Who's the boss? Who's the boss? If you have a glass, it's clean with rubber.
Alright, welcome to Painting with Rob Boss. I am Rob Boss. We're going to be painting an egg today. You're going to need a palette knife. You're going to want kind of a wider flat brush. And then you're going to want some flats or filberts. Various sizes. Kind of medium sized. Maybe a little bigger. Variety is ideal. And then we're going to want a thinner round brush today. Like this one right here. So there we go. Flats will work just fine. I like filberts. They're a little more versatile, but either will be fine. And the round brush we're going to need for painting lines. So let's get started. We got a glass palette over here. We're going to take a little bit of cyan, a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow. And we're going to mix together a dark tone to use for the shadow. Now, it's a really good idea, especially starting out when you're painting, to avoid using pure black. And a lot of painters will leave it out of their palette entirely, especially more impressionist style painters. So we're going to practice mixing a shadow tone without using any black. Alright, so first we're going to start by mixing light wash to kind of paint over the whole canvas. So I'm adding a little magenta. Now I'm going to wipe my palette knife. You want to have a paper towel around to wipe your palette knife. Then you can keep the colors from polluting each other, contaminating. We're going to mix in a little bit of the cyan here. We've got a nice violet going, you can see there. And then we're going to add some yellow. So I'm not too concerned with the color I get here. I just want kind of a general earth tone. And I'm just going to do a thin wash of that over the whole canvas here. Generally speaking, you want to do a wash of color over your surface before you start painting, just to get rid of all the white. The white can be really white or bright and intense, and if you miss a line, if you leave a little bit of your painting unpainted, it'll be very obvious. So if we add a nice little wash here to start, it makes it a little harder to tell if we don't cut our lines perfectly, or if we have a little area missing. So I'm going to add some water to my acrylic paint there and just create a thin wash. Just kind of wash that over the whole canvas. So you can add water as needed to thin it out. Main goal is to just get enough coverage to get that whole canvas covered. Alright, so you can add more water directly on the canvas, you can add it into the paint. You just want to get that whole area covered. If you need to mix more color, go for it. Just kind of get that whole thing with a light wash of paint. So now we don't have that bright, intense white. It's going to make everything a little closer to neutral. And now we're ready to start painting our egg. Alright, so I'm going to switch over to my, back to my palette knife, and I'm going to mix a little more paint. If you've got paint still, you can use that. If you need to mix some more though, go ahead. We're going to be using a lot of this. We're kind of mix a shadow tone. Again, so we're trying to avoid using too much black. We'll get a little in there later, but for now we want to stick to these primary colors. I'm mixing a little magenta, a little cyan, got kind of a nice violet tone again, and I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow. So as you're mixing your shadow tone, you can adjust it as needed. All you need to do to adjust it is look at it and say, what color is this too much of? And then add the complementary color. So if it's too green, for instance, you'd add more magenta. If it's too violet, you add more yellow. Just kind of adjusting it. We're just kind of looking for like a low saturation, almost gray color. We don't want it to go too far in any sort of specific hue. Alright, so once I got a nice dark shadow tone, I'm going to get some retarder. So the retarder is a medium that we can mix with the paint. We also have gel medium. They're basically acrylic bodies that have no pigment in them, so they're clear. The retarder will also slow drying time. So we're going to be focusing in this drawing on rendering and making smooth gradients. So a big part of that is going to be slowing the drying a little bit. So I'm going to mix in some retarder with my shadow tone here. I want to mix it nice and good, get it all evenly distributed. And that will help keep my paint from drying quickly. With acrylic paint, you got a really fast drying time, and then it's no longer workable after it dries. So using a little bit of retarder helps with the rendering process and blending the paint. Alright, so now I'm going to take my round brush and I'm going to do my basic drawing. I'm going to kind of bring my round brush there to a nice point at the tip. After wetting it, I'm going to start painting. So I'm looking at my egg here, and I'm kind of picking the proportions here. So I'm going to hit the topmost point about there and the bottommost point about there. So I'm marking them first. And then I'm going to mark the left end and the right end. I'm going to put the left end about here and the right end right about here. Once I've got the kind of proportions mapped out, I'm going to go ahead and paint in the curves of the outline of the egg. If I mess these up, I can just wipe them off with the paper towel or just brush them back into the background. I don't have a ton of paint on here. I'm just drawing kind of lightly here. So if I make a mistake, it's pretty easy to correct. And I can refine the shape of my egg here as I paint everything in. One of the nice things about the acrylic paint is it has good coverage, so you can paint over mistakes you make. You can make corrections on top. You can also keep it thin and layer it and build it up that way. So it's a very versatile paint. The main drawback is that it dries fairly quickly, so you have to be expeditious in your painting and use techniques that kind of favor a speedy painting style. Alright, so I'm refining that curve just a little bit. And take the time to make sure that the overall shape of your egg is good and you're satisfied with it. It's important to avoid drawing mistakes early on, because when you paint on top of them, it gives you a lot of extra work to undo. Or if you can fix them now, you don't have to worry about that as much. I'm going to start introducing my white paint here. I'm just going to put a little dab of white paint there. And I'm going to take my palette knife here. I'll wipe off my shadow tone. Then I'm going to wipe it off on the paper towel here. And I'm going to mix in a little bit of retarder with my white paint. Got a little bit of contamination there, but it's alright. It's not going to be a big deal. A little more retarder. And again, that's to slow down the drying time of this white paint as well. I'll make it a little easier to blend as we get into this process. Alright, so now I'm going to switch to one of my filberts or my flat brushes. Something a little bit bigger is probably good to start with, and then we'll go in with something smaller to render the details. But I'm going to paint in a layer of white here. So this practice today is all about rendering the light and shadow as it hits the egg here. So we want to start by laying in the local color of the egg, which is going to be white. When we're doing other things, the local color is just whatever color the thing is, whatever color you would say it is. We want to keep this initial layer of white fairly thin so that we can build up on top of it. If it's really thick, it's going to be goopy. It's going to be hard to make layers on top. It's just going to all mix together. So we want to have a nice thin layer. So even if we can still see a little bit of the wash underneath, that's okay. We don't need it to be completely opaque just yet. We're going to kind of build the layers up as we work. So we just kind of want to get a thin layer of white. So as you're painting this in, you can also refine the shape of your egg a little bit if you need to. You can adjust the outline. You feel like you didn't quite get it the first time. I'm going to try to make this as smoothed out as we can get it. We just want to get that whole thing painted in. So something to think about as you work this is to maybe try to make cross contour strokes. So strokes that match the curvature of the egg. They'll kind of reinforce the three-dimensional quality of the egg itself if you kind of go in and define those curves as you're making the strokes. Every once in a while you want to wet your bristles if things get a little too stiff. And when you're getting ready to switch to another brush, just swish your bristles around a little bit, wipe off any extra paint, and set that aside. We don't want to leave our brushes soaking in the water. That's a bad idea. It'll make the bristles come out. But we don't want them to dry out. So wet the bristles when you're going to switch to another brush, and then set it aside. Alright, so I've switched back to my round brush now, and now I'm drawing in the cast shadow here. So we're going to have two basic shadow types here. We're going to have a cast shadow, which is the area on the table here where the light is being blocked and the egg is casting a shadow. And then we're going to have the attached shadow, which is the area on the egg that's not being hit directly by the light and is therefore in darkness. So I'm just trying to draw in the line of this cast shadow here. So we've got a little more light coming from up and to the right. So the shadow is shifted a little bit to the left here. Just ever so slightly. All right, I'm going to get this brush back out. I'm wiping off as much paint as I can. I'm not painting the shadow here. So I'll just switch to something a little bigger. Flat or a filbert would work just fine for this. The filbert is kind of a flat brush with a curved tip, and the flat is a flat brush with a square tip. The filbert does a little better at cutting in lines if you need to paint edges. It also is a little bit softer and leaves fewer brush strokes generally because it doesn't have those corners on the bristles. Those corners tend to leave brush strokes. Alright, so I'm just kind of slowly painting in the shadow here. If your paint starts to get too stiff, you can add a little bit of water to wet it a little bit. You don't want to do too much because it's going to thin the paint down. So you kind of have to balance the amount of moisture in there as you work. Alright, so there's our cast shadow there. Try to smooth that out as much as I can. Trying to get nice even coverage in the shadow area. So our shadow area should be pretty flat, so we want to have nice even coverage in there. And we want to also practice not leaving brush strokes, getting everything smooth and finished as much as we can. Cutting in that line, that's going to be the edge of the egg there, so I want to define that as clearly and carefully as possible. And just finishing up the shadow shape. Alright. So now I'm going to switch back to my round brush. And now I'm going to paint in the attached shadow. So what I'm looking for here is the border of the shadow. And that border is what we call the terminator line. So I'm trying to paint in my terminator line to define the shadow edge. So underneath the terminator line, I'm going to have one flat value of shadow for the most part. We'll talk about the exception to that in a little bit. But we're going to start with one flat value of shadow. And then up above that, we're going to have a gradient that gradually transitions into the light areas. All right, so I'm getting my palette knife back. I'm going to mix in a little bit of white that I had on my knife. If you don't have white on there, you can gather some. I just want to lighten this shadow tone just a little bit. A little too light. So I'm going to leave that section right there to be sort of a medium tone. I'm going to kind of stretch this out. So now I've got a kind of darker tone on the left and more of a medium tone on the right. Add a little more white to this. So I want kind of a maybe 3 and a 4 value. So kind of a medium dark and a medium. So now I'm going to take my medium dark here. I want to paint in that shadow. I want to try to match it to what I'm seeing on my egg as much as I can. And I can adjust it as needed, but I want to get as good a match as I can to start. Paint's starting to stiffen up a little bit, so I'm adding a little bit of water to it. Need to be careful though, because I don't want to thin it out too much. When you add water to the acrylic, if it gets too thin, the pigment starts kind of flowing around in unpredictable ways, and it doesn't have that smooth consistency that we're looking for to get more even coverage there. So generally speaking, you have to balance the amount of water versus medium that you add. You want to try to stay half water, half medium at the most as far as water content goes for most stuff. All right, so we basically got that shadow painted in. I'm going to smooth that out a little bit. And now we want to have a gradient, a nice gradual transition from the shadow area here towards the highlights. All right, so I'm going to use a clean brush here. If my paint's still wet enough, I can start pulling the paint into the highlight areas. It may have dried out a little too much, in which case I'll have to put more paint on there. So you can see that when the paint starts to dry, before it's completely dry, you can still move it a little bit, but it gets a little unpredictable and it's a little less smooth. So we're going to take a little bit of this medium tone and add that on here, kind of along that terminator line. And we want to try to work with it while it's still wet. So now I'm taking my blending brush here. I've got one brush for applying the paint and a separate, relatively clean brush for blending. And you can think about it like you'd think about a charcoal stick and a tortilla. You got the charcoal stick for applying pigment, and then the tortilla for blending it in to the paper. Same idea here. We got one brush that we use to apply the pigment, and then a second one that we use to blend it in. All right, so this is drying pretty quickly. I'm going to add a little bit of retarder, just straight retarder, to see if I could get this to flow a little bit more. So you can use the water to loosen the paint up a little bit. You can also use the retarder or a medium. Sometimes those will get it to flow. If it gets too watery, if it's moving around too much, if it's starting to pull up under layers, add a little of retardant or a little medium, and that should help. All right, so I'm trying to mix a little more shadow tone. pulled some of this off earlier, so I'm trying to build up that shadow just a little bit more. There we go. Trying to blend that as smooth as I can. Alright, so now we're going to add a little bit more. And you can add more retardant or more retarder or more medium as you kind of work towards the highlight. And that'll thin that shadow tone out. You'll have a more clear body added in. So it'll make the glaze layers a little bit thinner as you work. So that's a good way to kind of pull a nice gradient there. We want to make this as smooth as we can as we work through. And once we get kind of to the highlight, we'll start mixing the other direction. We'll pull some white and start blending that in as well. Kind of working back and forth and layering it and building it up until we've got a nice smooth surface at the end. Alright, still a little rough, but we're kind of getting the idea here. Going a little darker with the shadow here. You can see it's pulling up the under layers. So sometimes when you get too much water on there, it'll start to pull up the layers you've already laid down. You got to be careful with that. Alright, so now I'm going to try pulling the highlight down. We'll let this shadow area dry a little bit since I'm pulling up paint. So now we're going to mix a little bit of retarder in with our white. And we're going to work from the highlight towards the shadow. We're mixing the retarder and the white. I'm going to mix it up good, get even distribution there. Got a little paint on my canvas there. You can wipe that off with a paper towel if you misplace a mark. As long as you do it pretty quick, it should be easy to take off. So now I'm going to look at where the highlight is hitting my egg. I'm going to paint that in with some pure white. I want to have nice, thick, pure white there. That's going to be our brightest point in the painting. So we want to use our purest white. And then we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to add a little bit of pigment with our brush. I'm just kind of dabbing it on. I don't want too much paint on there. And then I'm going to use my mixing brush to kind of smooth it out. Alright, so we're going to kind of repeat this same process, working from shadow towards highlight, and then working backwards from highlight to shadow. Just kind of building up layers gradually and working through. So I'm going to speed up the rest of this so you can kind of see, but that's the basic process. You just kind of work from the shadows to the highlight, and then highlight back to shadows. Add retarder if you think it's drying out too fast. It gives you a little more working time. But just kind of build up those layers until you get kind of a finished piece here. Use a little bit of a hatching technique. Alright, so let's go ahead and speed up the rest of this, and I'll walk you through it as it's going. Alright, so we're just kind of adding white to the white side. I'm going to blend it all together, smooth it out. We really want to hit that highlight repeatedly, and then pull the pigment out from there. Now I'm mixing kind of a medium light tone. Painting that in, and then kind of blending it with the clean brush. A little more white. Your highlight area is going to be pretty light, and the gradient's going to be really gradual and slow until you get to that terminator line, and then it happens pretty quickly. So generally speaking, that highlight area is going to be pretty bright. Now I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of tone to my background here. I'm painting it on a red table, so I'm doing red. You can do whatever you want, though. It's not even really a necessary step. I'm just letting my layers dry a little bit before I go and kind of continue building them up. So you can choose your color. You can get creative with it, or just paint it whatever table color you've got. All right, so now we're going to make some further revisions. Got a pretty good base layer laid in, but I think there's room for some more improvements. We're going to talk about doing that. Mixing a shadow tone up again. And I'm going to add that in to my shadow. Alright, so let's take a little bit of that. We'll mix it in with this little white, lighten it up a little bit. Go for kind of a medium dark. Pull it up here just a little bit. Kind of block in this shadow one more time. And go ahead and be bold, go a little bit darker. Get a little more contrast going. It gotten a little too dark there, so we're going to lighten it up a little bit. This is all what you do. You're just kind of adjusting constantly, moving the tone around, trying to get a good match, but also a good image. It's always a balance between getting a good painting with contrast and matching what you're seeing in front of you. So now I'm kind of blending my shadow tone there in to the rest of the egg. Kind of following that terminator line again. Want nice flat shadow below that terminator line, and then that smooth gradient coming up. As we build the layers up, we're getting less absorption by the canvas. Working on top of acrylic layers now. The layers are also showing through and showing the underlayers as well. So we're getting a much more complex, sort of solid painting as we build those layers up. Alright, so I've got more of a medium tone here. I'm transitioning into the highlight area. Just kind of working that transition, just trying to get as smooth a gradient as possible. That's the general idea. I'm doing kind of a medium light tone, a little bit of retarder, just to get that transition from medium to the highlight there. As you can see, we start off with real thin layers, and then as we get closer to the finished piece, we're kind of thickening up the paint. Lighten this highlight area just a little bit. Again, you don't have to paint every spot you want painted. You can just lay the paint on, kind of a cross-hatching technique, and then use your blending brush and kind of blend it in. And that can help you get the right amount of paint when you're trying to do a gradient. You have to be pretty quick about it. As you can see, My paint's already starting to dry. Just kind of layering thin layers of white on top until we get it to the level we want it to be at. Every once in a while I have to go back in and touch up the highlight. Alright, now down here, if you look in your shadow, you'll notice that you've got a little area at the bottom of the shadow that seems a little bit lighter than the rest. That's the reflected light from the table. So the light's going to hit the table around the egg, around that shadow, and some of the light, just a little bit, is going to reflect back up. It's going to create a little slightly lighter area in the shadow. You don't want this to be super light. A lot of times we over exaggerate how light this is. Don't make it too light. Should be just slightly darker than the rest of the shadow there. Alright, I'm cleaning off my brushes, trying to make sure they're staying wet. Wipe off my palette knife. I'll mix a little bit of cyan, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red. Make my nice shadow tone here. Looks pretty good. Go ahead and take another pass on the shadow here. Try to flatten that out. Just thicken up the layer a little bit. I want a nice flat shadow in there. That looks better with the second layer. And now I'm actually going to add a little bit of black. So I'm going to add black to my shadow tone. I'm not going to use pure black, but I'm just going to try to take this a notch darker. And I'm just going to sneak that slightly darker shade right underneath the edge of the egg. So there's going to be a spot when you have a curved object like this, when you have a sphere or an ovaloid object, right under it where you've got an intense pool of shadow where nothing's hitting. Blend this a little bit into my shadow. And there we go. Want to be real subtle. Alright, there we go. And that is our finished egg. So here we go. You want to get the rendering as smooth as possible. Get a nice gradient. Just try to get everything as smooth and nice as you can. Alright, so here we're going to talk about how to clean up the palette. The first thing we want to do is get as much of the paint off as possible. You can just use a palette knife and a paper towel. You're just going to scrape the paint off and wipe it onto that paper towel. Not all of the paint is going to come off, especially if you've had kind of a longer session and it's had a chance to dry. That's okay. Just trying to get as much off as you can. We don't want it to go down the pipes because it'll plug them up. So especially anything that is partially solidified or entirely dried, we want to get off of that palette. Alright, so after we've given it a good scraping, we're going to fold our paper towel up or grab another paper towel. We're just going to wipe off as much paint as we can. You can see that a good chunk of the paint's coming off, but some's still sticking. Depending on how long you've been painting, it may be more or less sticky on there. Now I'm going to use a little bit of wet paper towel. I'm just going to dip some paper towel into my water cup here. And I'm going to wipe that down. This will take most of the paint off if it's unless it's completely dry. It should all come off. After I do my wet paper towel, I'm going to make another pass with kind of a drier paper towel. You can scrape with a palette knife if you need to. You can also scrape with a razor blade or a metal palette knife if you need to. Then I'm going to make another pass with a dry paper towel and try to wipe everything clean. So doing it this way, I can get most of my palette done and clean without taking it to the sink. These palettes have foam core for the backing, so we don't really want to put them in the sink directly and wash them off. So you really want to wipe them down with paper towels and get as much off as you can without putting it into the sink under the running water. And there it is. Looks pretty good. So that's how to clean your palette. You can do all this before going to the sink, so we don't have a lot of backup there. And that's how you do it. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Painting with Rob Boss.
We're gonna paint. Don't tell me that you ain't. We're gonna draw. 'Cause I'm laying down the law. We're gonna art. If you don't like it, smell a flower. 'Cause I'm not good with the powers of the bar.